Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and so today we're going to try to tackle the question of, do we live in a simulation? Is this world right here real, or is this just an imaginary world created by some kind of a supercomputer? And are we all just simulations inside the computer, living our lives, pretending that it's all real? And to be honest, we're not going to be able to answer this question in this video, but we are going to actually tackle something else. Is it even possible to answer this question? And that's, of course, to me, as a science communicator, a much more interesting perspective. Because there are scientists out there that are trying to devise different experiments in order to see if we are in a simulation after all. Although, spoiler alert, at the moment the answer does seem to be no. But let's talk a little bit more about this, and let's maybe start with a bit of a history, just to understand that this is a really ancient question. As a matter of fact, it was even asked by the ancient Greeks. The famous Plato had a few propositions on the human perception, and even implied that maybe we don't really see what we actually see. Maybe all we see are just shadows on a wall. But he was obviously not the only one. For example, various Chinese philosophers, such as the Chinese writer Zhuangzi, had a passage known as the butterfly dream. Just as the name implies, in the passage, someone dreams of being a butterfly, flying around, waking up and realizing all of it was just a dream, even though it looked and felt so real. But this was really common amongst the Greeks. Monimus talked about it, Anazarchus talked about it, and it was brought up over and over again and became a pretty popular topic in philosophy. Even various Mesopotamic cultures, such as the Aztecs, had a few stories where the world was imagined to be nothing but a painting created by a god, with each of us just being the characters in his painting. And so when it comes to philosophy or philosophical concepts, this is definitely a really big one and quite popular throughout the ages amongst various cultures. But naturally it's become a little bit more popular in modern days, and there is a really good reason for that: video games. But I guess also things like virtual reality, the idea of metaverse, and so on. Here we now actually have physical examples where you can become someone else. And sometimes it does start to feel quite real. Since the computers have been getting more and more complex over time, and since we reached the point where we can even simulate time itself by simulating the galaxy creation, star formation, and the creation of matter over billions of years, it's sort of natural to assume that at some point the complexity is going to become so ridiculous that none of this will be different from the actual reality. Although here a really important correction. This is just an assumption. At the moment all of these supercomputer simulations are still relatively primitive. For example, the size of a single particle here is usually in hundreds of kilometers. Obviously not a tiny particle like in the real world. But despite of all of this, it still is logical to assume that, well, maybe there is something to this idea. As a matter of fact, quite a lot of thinkers, quite a lot of scientists have been thinking about this and have been actually arguing about this to some extent. I mean, obviously Elon Musk brought up this idea a few times, but so did Neil deGrasse Tyson, with him thinking that it's a maybe 50-50. But this is of course all philosophy. And since this is not a channel on Asian philosophy, nor is this a channel that tries to speculate about things too much, I wanted to actually talk about the science, or is it even possible for us to prove any of this? Because what makes it scientific is of course the fact that it can be proven, or more importantly, disproven. There is some kind of an experimental setup. And if it's just an idea that can only be thought about and not tested in any way, well, in that case, for me personally, it doesn't really matter that much. I'm not particularly interested in untestable ideas. So, science. Can we actually do it? With the answer being, maybe. But in order to even understand how this could work, we first have to understand the scientific concepts that would apply to this simulation hypothesis. Although first, a quick clarification. This is not to be confused with the holographic principle. The principle from the string theory. And I know that some people have confused these ideas because I've got so many emails about this. The holographic principle simply states that, according to string theory, the world we live in, the three-dimensional, or I guess four-dimensional world, is actually created by extremely minute particles as they sort of project the entire reality on a much bigger scale. And so here it's still a real world, but it's just created by very minute, tiny strings that then form the reality around us. Here nothing suggests that this is a simulation at all. In contrast, the simulation hypothesis is basically the premise of the movie Matrix. So just a bit of a clarification here. And so the question is, what exactly are some of the scientific signs potentially pointing at this being true? Well, the first one is based on what we know about video games and virtual reality. All computers today obviously have some kind of a processing limit. For example, I myself could not even use virtual reality sets up until extremely recently. Some of the older virtual reality sets were just a little bit too slow and would give me and a lot of other people a feeling of dizziness even if using this for just a few minutes. Now the speed is much faster, so it is a little bit more comfortable to use, but still not perfect. And so in this sense, there is a kind of a limitation based on the processing power, usually from the graphics card or the computer itself. Likewise, there is something very similar right here in the universe we live in. The limitations posed by the speed of light, and it just so happens that, according to Einstein's theories, once you start moving fast enough, the universe reacts accordingly, slowing down everything around you. In other words, one way to explain time dilation is by actually invoking the idea of simulation hypothesis. But this is still a little bit too philosophical, there's no actual proof just yet. Yet it's still unexplainable by the physics of the universe itself, and is definitely some kind of a limitation, physical limitation, in the fabric of the universe. Or the graphics card of the universe just has a certain limit. But still untestable, still no way to scientifically prove or disprove this, which puts it more in a philosophical basket, not in a scientific basket. We need something different. And so if we make an assumption that the simulation we live in has limited resources, and it cannot simulate everything in the universe all at once, there's maybe something else we can try to focus on. The idea is coming from quantum physics. If this is real, so basically if we do live in some kind of a video game, just like the video game, to save on processing power, the universe might only create the worlds observable by other players. Or to rephrase this, the world is only created when someone is looking at it directly. Everything outside of this world does not exist until observed. And this idea of the observer is very reminiscent of main ideas in quantum physics. We know that the observer effect plays a huge role based on various experiments, such as the famous double slit experiment. The experiment that has proved over and over again that on a quantum level, things can act both like a particle and a wave, and even large objects can exhibit wave-like properties, creating an interference pattern that disappears completely once you start observing the particles passing through the double slit. And so just like in video games, for some reason in a lot of quantum physics experiments, it's as if the world is rendered only when observed. And it's actually at this point where we kind of cross the boundary between this being a philosophy and potentially a scientific experiment. There's maybe a way to test this and to see if it's actually true. So how exactly do we test if this system only calculates reality when information needs to be processed for some kind of an observer? Or how do we test if the world does not exist when no one is looking? Well, in this case, this would also involve some kind of a double slit experiment, but this time with a bit of a twist. Or an additional layer involving even more uncertainty of whether there was an observer to begin with. And so in the regular version of the double slit experiment, when you fire single photons at a double slit inside the screen, you're going to start seeing this unusual pattern that's usually expected when the photons start acting as waves. But by adding a detector that's able to check which slit was used for the photon or the electron to pass through, this actually changes the pattern that's produced. It then starts to appear as if all of this was particles. And that's of course the main discovery from back in the days. Photons can be both particles and waves, but they cannot be both when observed at the same time. So it's a kind of a paradox here. A paradox that can to some extent be extended even further if you try to find a way to even make the observer itself kind of random and completely unpredictable. In one version of this experiment, the scientists proposed that maybe we can use various USB drives to collect the actual data that's not seen by anyone including the experimenter. And you actually keep doing this randomly until you collect enough of these flash drives to contain tons and tons of data that's not been seen by any physical observer, a human being. And because even the observer part is now randomized, even without looking at the data, you now randomly remove some of these USBs with, for example, a flip of a coin. And if there is a simulation, or basically if the test is successful, the scientists believe that the remaining data in these USB drives is going to start producing its own interference pattern corresponding to the randomness with which USB drives were destroyed or removed from the data. Or in other words, if the actual human observer did not matter here, the USB drives will create some kind of a random data indicative of a wave pattern extremely similar to the data produced by any experiment involving double slit. But if the observer did matter, the actual pattern will be a little bit different, possibly even very different, as if all of the collected data did not involve an observer, and so there's going to be some kind of a bias. And to some extent this might answer one question. Does the conscious observation of an experiment play a role in providing us with a collapsing wave function? Or can all of this be achieved by a simple physical apparatus, such as a computer collecting USB data? And so if the human observer does not matter, none of this will change at all, and all of this will provide exactly the same results. but if the observer is important, the results will be different. However, even though it sounds like a very simple experiment, even to date, since the original proposition in 2017, it has not been conducted successfully. It is still really challenging to set this up and to make it work in order to avoid any potential bias or any potential interference. And so the biggest challenge right now is to actually set up the experiment without any potential biases, without any potential interferences. Hasn't been done yet, but could be done once someone comes up with something really intriguing. And so it's still possible to make this very biased. But nevertheless, this is at least one potential way of testing this somewhat philosophical idea and to possibly give us a final answer. Do we live in a simulation after all? But here's the thing. There's at least one more experiment that's being planned by someone entirely different, using a slightly different method. And it's planned by the Information Physics Institute that I've briefly discussed in one of the previous videos, somewhere in the description. But we'll talk about this in the next part of this video. And so what's the answer right now? Well, the idea is still kind of philosophical, the premise is still kind of unproven or even without a potential proof, but based on our understanding of quantum physics, and based on what we know from various experiments such as the double slit experiment, there's maybe a way to prove or disprove this once and for all. Although I'm still going to err on the side of caution here and suggest that we probably do not live in a simulation. So yeah, go to work tomorrow, or to school, or just go and do your thing. Don't pretend that any of this is unreal. And here's actually another philosophical proposition that kind of bothers me with this. If we do live in a simulation, it means that that other world that we live in is not very good. Because think about it. Usually we play virtual reality games to escape the reality here. Escapism. Yeah, that's not a very happy thought. Anyway, we'll discuss more in the next video. And so make sure to subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, and support this channel on Patreon by joining channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.